Good evening, everybody. My name is Dolores O'Riordan, and I'm the Director of UCD's Institute of Food and Health. I'm delighted that you can join us this evening. We're just delaying the start there because we can still see that people are coming online, and it's fantastic to see so many of you logging in this evening. So this series of public lectures really is designed to ensure that you have expert knowledge being delivered by scientists who are researching in the area. We understand it really can be difficult to differentiate the fact from fiction, so you can be assured that what you hear in these public lectures from the Institute of Food and Health is clearly based on scientific evidence. As I say, we've had a number of lectures in this area. For those of you who weren't able to join us previously, you can access them on our website. And tonight, I'm very much looking forward to hearing about the important topic of nutrition and its role in adolescent development. Of course, we can all see from watching the growth of adolescence that it's a key area of change, not only physically, but also from a brain development point of view, from an emotional point of view, and nutrition plays a very important part in this. So tonight we're going to start with a talk. It's going to be delivered by Dr. Breige McNulty. And then, as we've had in the other public lecture series, there will be an opportunity for you to ask some questions at the end with any of the burning questions that you have, possibly related to raising your own adolescent. And in addition to Dr. Breige McNulty, Dr. Sarah Brown will also be available to take some of the questions that you may have. So we'll start with the presentation this evening. I'll hand over to my colleague, Professor Lorraine Brennan, who will now introduce you to the speakers, and then we can get started. So you're all very welcome this evening.
Good evening, everybody. And as Dolores said, you're very welcome to tonight's public lecture. So I'm going to start off by introducing Breige and Sarah. So Breige is an assistant professor here in UCD, in the School of Agriculture and Food Science and the Institute of Food and Health. She completed her PhD in human nutrition at Ulster University, and then since then she's been based in UCD managing the National Food Consumption Surveys in Ireland. Breige's main research interests are in the area of food consumption and using that food consumption data to try and understand the impact of nutrients, food ingredients and chemicals on health with a view to underpinning food safety and policy. And then Sarah is going to join Breige at the very end to help answer some of the questions. And Sarah is a registered dietitian. She's also an assistant professor in clinical nutrition and dietetics in the School of Public Health, Physiotherapy and Sports Science. She's a background in community dietetics and community health promotion. Her research interests include dietary behaviours of children and adolescents, childhood obesity, food environments and health behaviour. So I'm extremely happy that both Breige and Sarah agreed to give this lecture tonight, and without further ado, I'll hand over to Breige.
Thanks, Lorraine, and thanks, Dolores, for that welcome. And to welcome everyone here this evening. It's great to be able to give this virtual lecture to you all. And hopefully I'll be able to answer any questions you have at the end with my colleague, Sarah. So I suppose from what Lorraine has said, my background is really looking at nutrition surveys and looking across the different life stages. And well, unfortunately, we're in the midst of looking at adolescents in Ireland. We haven't got the data as yet, but some of the information that I've provided in this presentation really is underpinned by the previous survey we did. So what I want to do first is just take you through the layout of the next 30 minutes and what I want to go through. So I think before we start to look at nutritional requirements, we really need to understand what's happening during this adolescent period. So we need to understand what are those developmental changes. And then, of course, we can talk about what are the particular nutritional requirements that we should highlight during this period. And lastly, what I want to finish off on is just to kind of look at some nutritional considerations that seem to highlight or be highlighted during that adolescent period. So when I talk about adolescence, what I'm talking about, just to, I suppose, to set the scene, it is the teenage years. So I'm really looking at the 13 years and onwards to about 18 years. And of course, a lot of growth happens during that point in time. So not only the physical, so physical is probably what we see, but cognitive and emotional as well. So adolescents will start to think greater abstract thinking, goal setting, become more independent and become more emotionally stable. And all of that will feed into the food choices that teenagers make. And we need to understand that, and we'll come back to that later on when we look at food choice. But really, I suppose when we talk about the nutritional requirements, they back up the physical changes as well. So it is when puberty begins, and what we see is there's a rapid growth that happens during this period of time. So it is one of the most rapid phases of physical growth during all our life stages, apart from maybe when we were infants, maybe the first year of life. We do see a lot of growth as well, but 1/3 of all our growth will occur during them teenage years. And so we need to be cognizant of the diet that is provided during them stages. And what's probably the most physical thing we see is that there is an increase in height. So that height that we see is average about 20 centimeters in girls and about an average of 23 centimeters in boys. Now that will vary dependent on that individual. So some will grow more than that, some will grow less than that. But we do see that gain in height. Also during the period, what we do see as well is a growth spurt. So during that teenage years, you'll have a 2 to 3 year period where there seem to be just growing overnight, just seem to be gaining so much. And what we call is the growth spurt. So there's just a huge amount of growth. And this is totally normal. This is what we would expect to see. And that growth is because the bones are growing. So what we see is those long bones that we see in our arms and our legs are increasing. So they're expanding. And what we see is there's a rapid amount of bone mineralization that's happening during that stage. So if we look at this graph here, so this is over all the life stages. And this is the amount of bone mineral density that we gain throughout our life. And if we look at the period between 10 years and 20 years, this is where we see the greatest rate of increase of bone mineral density. So this stage of life in our adolescence is where we can have a huge impact for later on in life on the quality of our bone mineral density. We will go on to attain our peak bone mass by the age of around 30, but this is the stage where we'll grow in the adolescence, where we're gain the biggest increase. And not only do we see the height difference, we also see a difference in body composition. And again, this is to be expected. So going into or before puberty, most boys and girls will have more or less the same lean body tissue, the same proportions. But what we see happening when we hit adolescence is we start to gain more of the hormones such as testosterone and estrogen, and that has a big impact on our body composition. So for males, the increase in testosterone that we would see will mean that they'll gain more muscle mass, heavier skeletons, and have a greater quantity than females. Whereas females tend to gain more fat mass, and then because of that gain in fat mass, menstruation will start and it will become regular. Again, this is what we expect to see, and I suppose that's the whole emotional, physical changes that we have over that period of time. So what are the main nutrient requirements that we need to consider during these teenage years when we look at it? And before I go into the nutrients and those particular nutrients, it's to come back that we don't eat nutrients, we eat foods, and you've probably heard a lot of that if you've listened to the lecture series, and we know that we do eat foods on a daily basis. And when we look at it on a population level and how to give advice for that, we do have the food pyramid. So this is what in Ireland we have, and this provides on an overview of the diet on a daily basis what we should be trying to incorporate in it. And you can see that it's at the bottom, vegetables and fruits, and that's what we should have the most of. and then it goes on up to cereals, dairy, meats, etc. So overall, this is what we should be looking at. But what I want to do in the next couple of slides is go into the particular nutrients that relate to these food groups, and to show why they're really important. And I suppose the first thing that will, before we go into the macronutrients that provide energy, is to look at overall energy. So as we've just shown, there's a huge amount of growth happening during this period. And because of that, appetites will increase. So if you have an adolescent, or you are an adolescent, you'll know that your appetite increased. So you may feel hungry a lot more. And the challenge is to try and balance that optimal growth without the excessive weight gain. So to manage a healthy weight status. And if we look here, now this is a very simplified version of energy balance. You could incorporate a lot more, but if we look at it in simple terms, so the food that we consume is balanced out by what our body needs, so the basal metabolic rate, so that's repair and maintenance, and the metabolism normally on a day-to-day basis, and also physical activity. Now this physical activity is the variable part. So if you are an adolescent, or you have an adolescent child who spends quite a lot of time in sports activities, they will need quite a high amount of energy. However, if you're more sedentary, of course, that will decrease. So the amount of calories that we suggest will be based on activity. If you look at these two here, so for a moderate active teenage boy, the average or the requirement will be about 2,400 to 2,800 calories per day. And for a girl with moderate activity, it should be about 2,000 calories. So that's what we'd expect. It'll be slightly less if they were more sedentary, and slightly more if they're more active. So what's important when we look at this and where we get our energy from? Firstly, carbohydrates. So you'll see one of those food groups for wholemeal cereals, breads, potatoes, pasta, and rice. And this is where we get the majority of our energy from. So about over half, so 45 to 60% of adolescents' energy should come from carbohydrate sources. So it's quite a lot, and we look at the servings that are suggested to try and incorporate that in the diet. You can see for females, again, based on activity level, if you're moderately active, 4 servings per day. Males, if you're moderately active, 5 to 7 servings per day. So that's what you should be trying to incorporate. And of course, to do that, you will really need to eat carbohydrates in all the main meals and as part of your snacks as well. And just to show you what one serving is, so when we're talking about servings, you can see here, for example, a serving of bread will be 2 slices of wholemeal bread, or a serving of rice and pasta is a cup of cooked rice or pasta. So these are the types of servings that would be suggested to make up just one. And it's important when we talk about carbohydrate, and you'll see I had underlined wholemeal. It's important to also consider fibre. Fibre is really important in our diet, and we tend not to get enough of it. And that not only goes into adolescent, in the adolescent stage, it's through other population stages as well. When we looked at the previous work we did in the NTFS in the National Teens Food Survey back in 2005, I know it's quite a bit ago, and we'll hopefully have newer information now in the next year or so, but 4 out of 5 Irish teenagers didn't get enough dietary fibre. So it's important when we're choosing those carbohydrates that we tend to go for wholemeal or whole grain products, and that will increase the fibre. So we should be getting in an adolescent's diet about 19 to 21 grams per day. And we know that if we include this in the diet, that the fibre will make us feel fuller for longer. It would also aid our digestion and prevents any constipation problems, but also it's a healthy way to incorporate that into the diet, and also to maintain a healthy, balanced diet for later prevention of chronic diseases, because there is strong evidence that eating plenty of fibre reduces the risk of these chronic diseases, such as bowel cancer, etc. And also what would contribute to the fibre is fruit and veg. So when you looked at the pyramid that we have, fruit and veg is on the bottom because it's the one that we are supposed to get the most amount of servings per day from. So 5 to 7 servings is what's recommended for an adolescent. And the reason we need it, it's filling, it's high in fibre, as I said, but also low in calories, and provides a lot of different protective nutrients that we need in our diet. So we need to contribute to metabolizing that energy that we need, for example. So it's important to choose a rainbow, and a rainbow is that if we stick to the same fruits and veggies, and we don't include that variety, yes, they're going to have nutrients that are important, but we need to include the variety, because obviously different fruits, different veggies with lots of different colors in there will provide lots of different nutrients, and that's what we're looking for. So it's important to choose variety as well as increasing the amount of fruit and veg in the diet. Okay, the next thing that will contribute to energy, and one of the most, I suppose, controversial things probably, is protein. And how much protein do teens need? Well, if we look around us today and look at the supermarkets, it would seem that we need a lot of protein, because protein seems to be in lots of different products now. But realistically, we don't need that much, and we can get it just from our diets alone. We don't need to be looking elsewhere. So the protein needed is obviously to reach the peak during our growth spurt that you will have during adolescence and the repair of muscles and tissues. And if we look at it in terms of energy, it should be around 12 to 15% of our energy coming from protein. When we did the last time we looked at adolescents in Ireland, there was no issue with protein. They were getting 14.8% of their energy from protein sources, which was what we wanted to see. Now, if we were to work it out, so just down here at the bottom of this slide, I've worked it out in relation to, depending on your stages, so depending on the age of you as an adolescent, you can work it out per kilogram of weight, how much protein you need. So I've given it here for females and males. And if we were just to look at males and we were to take a regular 60 kilogram male, and if the recommendation is 0.86 to 0.1 per kilograms, what we would work out is about 52 to 55 grams per day would be required. So it's not a huge amount, and hence we don't need to supplement our diets. We can get it just from the sources alone. If we were to look at protein sources, I think we'd look then to look at the meat, poultry, fish, eggs, beans and nuts. So that shelf of the pyramid. And in that shelf of the pyramid, we're supposed to get 2 servings per day. So that's what we're looking for. And you can see here, these are all the different types of or portion sizes that we should be including. So you can see for meat and poultry, it's about the size of your palm of your hand that you're looking for. Whereas fish, it's about 100 gram serving. So you can see here a nice fillet of salmon, or eggs, it'd be 2 eggs. You can also get protein from beans and nuts, and also from soya as well. So they're all different types of products or ways to include protein in your diet. Okay, and I've included all the other ones, fat, sugar and salt, onto one slide. Fat, sugar and salt are probably the biggest demonized nutrients out there, and sometimes for a valid reason, but sometimes we need to look a wee bit further into it. So for fat, we do need fat in our diets. There's no way we could do without fat. It's the types of fat that we need to look at. And the recommendation for adolescents is that they should be getting 20 to 35% of their energy from fat sources. However, it should be less than 10% from saturated. So your saturated is what you get from highly processed foods, from fatty meat, from processed meats, etc. You'll get saturated fat, and we want to limit that. We want to include the mono unsaturated and polyunsaturated food types. So it's to look for those. And when we looked, the last time we looked at Irish teens, we found that, you know, they were consuming too much energy from saturated fats. Sugar, when we look at it, we tend to look at free sugar and added sugars in the diets. Now, the terminology can be confusing. Free and added sugars mean slightly different things, but it's more or less if you think of sugars that are added during the manufacturing process. Or if it's free sugars, it's that's freely available in the food. So if it's juices, etc. So we want to limit these. And we should be getting 10% or less from these types of sugar. And when we last looked at it in the older data in teens, we could see that it was about 12.4% of energy. So we do need to reduce the amount of sugar within our diets. And salt is another one. So like adults, teenagers should aim to have 6 grams or less per day from sodium or salt. And then the intake, when we last looked at it, was 7.2 grams per day in boys and 5.4 grams per day in girls. And again, we need to look at reducing this. So again, when you look at the top of the pyramid, you see this wee bit triangle cut off. And the reason it is cut off, it's unlike every other food group. We don't need it every day. So foods and drinks high in fat, sugar and salt, we need to limit them. We need to reduce the amount of them in our diets. So maximum once or twice a week is what is suggested to try and do that. Okay, the next thing I want, so we're leaving the macronutrients and then we're going to look at the vitamins and minerals. And of course I can't look at every vitamin and mineral. And more or less when we look at the Irish adolescent population, what we see is the majority are okay for vitamins and minerals, apart from the 3 ones that I wanted to pull out here: iron, calcium and vitamin D. They're really important during this stage of life, but unfortunately our intakes aren't as good as they could be. When it comes to calcium, as I said at the very beginning, we have growth, bone mineralization at this point, and it's really important that we have adequate calcium in our diets to aid that process. And if we don't, that will have consequences later on in our lives. So therefore we need adequate calcium requirements. And we need about, depending on the requirement, so there's different ways of looking at intakes and how much calcium we have, but in and around we need 1,150 milligrams per day in and around for calcium. The last time we looked at in Irish teenage girls, 42% were not having enough of the required calcium intakes, and slightly less, 23% in boys. The food group that relates to this is really the dairy food group. We will get a lot of calcium from dairy, and we need about 5 servings per day to include the amount, or is suggested that we include for this food group. And you can see here, these are the servings, so glass of milk, a pot of yogurt, or a portion or 25-gram serving of cheese. And I've just underneath given you an approximate, so they will differ depending on the type of cheese or the type of milk slightly, but in and around, they will give you about 200 milligrams of calcium for milk. And for example, if you were to look at cheddar cheese, it's about 190 milligram. So by including those 5 servings a day of dairy in your diet, you will hit the calcium requirement that you need, and therefore hit the amount that you need to keep peak performance in mineralizing those bones. Now, without vitamin D, calcium doesn't work too well. So we do need both together. So we always kind of look at calcium and vitamin D, and it's important because it helps regulate the amount of calcium when within our bodies. Again, vitamin D, and it's not only adolescence, it's throughout the life stages. We have a problem with vitamin D. Now, you wouldn't think that if we look out today, it's quite sunny here with me in Dublin anyway, and we can get it from exposure to the sun. But when it comes to intakes, we are supposed to get 10 micrograms per day. However, the amount that we get is very, very low. So you can see there, when the last time we looked at it in adolescence, it was quite low. And we can see that if we looked at adequate or inadequate intakes, about nearly all of the population weren't meeting the requirements. So it's one of the biggest issues when it comes to bone mineralization is vitamin D and calcium together. Again, sources that we can get vitamin D into the diet. So oily fish, eggs, so they will provide, as you can see, about 6 micrograms or 3.5 micrograms per serving. And again, these are naturally what we should be including in our diet. We look at these protein or the meat group, and we should be including. Also, another source, and I think quite a good source, is fortified foods, such as breakfast cereals. What we see nowadays is there's a lot of fortified foods, and they do provide a good, adequate amount of other nutrients within our diet, and vitamin D is one of them. So do look out at fortified foods, such as breakfast cereals, to see if they are fortified in vitamin D, if you want to increase your vitamin D within your diet. And lastly, the other nutrient is iron. So iron is really, really important during this stage because it increases blood volume, we increase the blood volume during this adolescent period, increasing lean body mass, and of course menstruation starts for teenage girls. And all that means is that we do have an increased iron requirement during this stage, so it's really important. And what we see is if we don't have enough iron in our diet, we'll see anemia, reduced ability to concentrate, to do cognitive, so do study, feeling tired, feeling or looking pale. So they're the kind of things that you can look out for in relation to if there's not enough iron in the diet. And at this stage, girls need more than boys. It's one of the unique nutrients where girls actually do need more than boys. But what we see is that teenage girls, when we last looked at them, didn't get enough. So 41% had below the adequate intake. So it's something that we need to look at. And how much do teens need to incorporate in their diet? So it's between, again, depending on the recommendation you're looking at, but about 11 to 13 milligrams required per day. Now, depending on the sources, so for iron, we would say, you know, it is meat sources, and you can see here, if we looked at a serving of their lovely pork chops there, it would give you about 2 milligrams from that serving. But there are other sources. The difference is we look at iron in two different ways. We can look at it heme iron and non-heme iron. Heme iron is easier absorbed into the body, and heme iron would come from your meat sources. Your non-heme iron would be coming from, say, your kidney beans here or your green leafy vegetables. So it's not as easily absorbed from the body. And also, again, another good source is fortified foods. So iron, again, in breakfast cereals, you see a lot of breakfast cereals fortified with iron, and that's a good way of getting it into your diet. And also to say that if vitamin C, so iron and vitamin C work together. So vitamin C would help you absorb iron. So potentially you might want to, with your meal, have a glass of orange juice to increase the iron content that you're going to be able to absorb from that. And one thing to avoid is tea and coffee, because tea and coffee contains things like polyphenols, and polyphenols make it really hard for our body to absorb the iron. So it's recommended that you don't drink tea and coffee with a meal. If you do want to drink it, maybe wait about 30 minutes or later after you've consumed that meal, so that you have time to absorb the nutrients, particularly iron in this case, from that food. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to touch on is nutritional considerations. And I suppose food choice factors. During this period of time, many of us, we've all gone through this, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of changes within the body, and a lot of emotions, and there's many different reasons that we choose food. And it's no different for adolescents. So it could be personal factors, it could be media influence, it could be peer pressure, it could be environmental factors, all the different reasons. And I think we need to consider these when we're looking at adolescents' diets and, you know, trying to understand them. And I suppose one thing that is, or we should consider during this period or stage of life is balance, or weight balance. So we mentioned at the beginning, you know, that we should manage that energy balance. And sometimes it's not the easiest, but because it is important for adolescents to obtain enough energy and nutrients for their growth and development. And we need to look at the foods that they're obtaining it from, because if we choose, or if they choose highly energy dense foods that provide a lot of energy but don't provide the nutrients, then they're potentially going to tip that balance in the wrong way and start to gain weight. So it's something that we need to look out for. Again, some teenagers try to control their weight by using unsuitable methods. And what I mean here is maybe skipping meals or not including breakfast, or deciding to completely eliminate a food group from their diet. And we really need to consider that, you know, the amount of energy that a teenager needs. You can see Carbohydrates especially is important for that, and they need to be eating their 3 meals a day and having their snacks to maintain that constant energy throughout the day. So if they start to skip or start to eliminate food groups, potentially that has a knock-on effect on the levels of nutrients within that they're consuming. And we need to be able to encourage a healthy lifestyle during this stage, because hopefully what they gain and understand and their food choices that they start to make at this point will mean that they'll have or maintain that healthy diet right into adulthood. The other thing I wanted to touch on, it seems to come up a lot nowadays, is plant-based diets or vegetarian or vegan diets, and whether it's healthy to have a diet like this. And it can be healthy. There is no reason why a plant-based diet can't be healthy, but you do need to know what you're doing before you attempt it. It's not as easy to gain all the nutrients that you need, especially, I suppose, the calcium and the vitamin D that you need, while just going with a plant-based diet. And because of that, you need to plan. So if it is something, or something your adolescent is considering or is doing, planning is key. So they need to understand what nutrients they should focus in on, and what are the other plant-based foods that they could incorporate into the diet to help build the nutrients that they need. And I've just taken this table here from Safe Food, and they provided, I think, as a lovely kind of an overview. And you can see here, these are the key nutrients, some of them which we've talked about: protein, calcium and iron within the diet. So particularly these ones we do get from animal sources. We can get quite easily from animal sources or dairy sources overall. And these gives an overview of what kind of plant sources that we could have for an alternative source. So for example, calcium, dairy, as I said, is a big, we get a lot of calcium from dairy, but we also can get from green leafy vegetables, from nuts, etc. And iron, and there's another thing, again, that goes back, that we can get it from fortified iron breakfast cereals, dried fruits. And the other one that I didn't mention, the only reason being vitamin B12 isn't, if you aren't consuming a pure kind of vegan based diet, then vitamin B12 you should be able to incorporate from dairy sources or meats. And it's not usually a risk within that adolescent population that we see in Ireland. However, if you're going down the route of plant-based diets or a vegan diet, B12 is important. It's important for energy metabolism and for other things within our body. So you need to consider it, where you're going to get it. There is some foods fortified with breads, and also yeast extracts would provide B12 as well. Okay, before I finish up for this evening and open the floor to questions, just to give the key recommendations to take from that in relation to adolescents and what the key nutrients. So firstly, all meals are important, so enjoy them, but include them all. So it's important to have, you know, your 3 meals a day and snacking throughout. You've a lot of energy needed to maintain that growth. So to try and do that, we do need all meals and snacks. But in doing so, try to include good sources. So lean meats, good sources of poly and monounsaturated fats, and carbohydrates include whole grain, wholemeal carbohydrates. And remember to eat a variety of fruit and veg to try and get to your 5 to 7 servings per day. Things that I didn't mention but also are very, very important is hydration. So it's important to drink plenty of fluids throughout the day. So we should be aiming between 2 to 2.5 litres per day. Hopefully not all at once, but if we can do that throughout the day, that will help your body stay hydrated. Get enough rest and sleep. Really important. We forget about this. We forget that during this period of time, like I said, a huge amount of growth and repair, and your body needs to rest to do that. So if we don't give your body that rest and don't get enough sleep, it won't be able to do that growth that it needs to do. And also stay active. So when we talk about energy balance or weight status, it's important also to talk about activity levels. And the recommendation is that you should be getting about 60 minutes of activity on a daily basis. So to keep that in mind. And just to note the resources out there for all of you as well. So you'll see a lot of the food pyramid that I talked about. So you can go online and look this up and download the PDF if you want. This is coming from the FSAI. Safe Food is also a really good resource. They have a whole section on teenagers. And something that I haven't talked about, but it's sports and teenage sports, but also Safe Food have a really good document on this, and meal plans in this area, so another good resource. And the INDI as well have a lovely section on teenage health as well, so you can go online to all of these. And finally, just to say thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoy the lecture, and I welcome any questions. And lastly, just to say that I suppose we're finishing up for the summer, more or less. So the next talk that we're going to have, a very interesting one, is by Africa Sullivan in September. So what is a healthy, sustainable diet? So please do tune in again for that one later on in the year. So thank you very much.